I want to go into the word here, and I'm going to preach the whole chapter of Matthew 14, but we're going to jump into different parts of it, okay? I want to start at the end, then we're going to move to the beginning, so buckle your seatbelt. Matthew 14, starting in verse 30, says this: when Jesus saw the strong wind and waves, when he saw the strong wind and waves, which was he being the apostle Peter. When he saw the strong wind and waves, when Peter saw the strong wind and waves, he was terrified, he was afraid, and he began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. And Jesus immediately snatched him up, reached out, grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" Why did you doubt me? That reads as a rhetorical question. It may have been a rhetorical question, but I would say it's more than a rhetorical question. That's a very good question. And the answer to that question is found in the entire book of Matthew chapter 14. In the book of Matthew in chapter 14. Matthew 14, let's look at the whole thing. The first 12 verses in Matthew 14 tell the story of the beheading of John the Baptist. John the Baptist is decapitated in the beginning of Matthew 14. Who is John the Baptist? John the Baptist is Jesus' favorite cousin. John the Baptist was the forerunner of Jesus. John the Baptist's whole entire life was about shining a light on Jesus. John the Baptist was losing following to Jesus, and his disciples came to him and was like, "People are leaving." He goes, I'm just here to shine a light on him. Go with him. Jesus had such affection for John the Baptist that 3 chapters earlier in Matthew 11:11, Jesus says, "There's never been a man who's lived who is greater." Jesus, who knew a little bit about great people, said the greatest of all time is John. How did John die? John was arrested, and Herod Antipas was over the region, was in charge. Herod Antipas had taken his brother's wife, named Herodias. He throws a party one night. Everybody's drunk. Everybody's lit. Everybody's having a good time. Herodias' daughter comes in and does a seductive dance. So his new wife's daughter danced seductively, and it was apparently one heck of a dance, because Herod goes, "Wow, what would you like? I'll give you whatever you want." I mean, those moves have wormed their way into my heart to the point that I will give you, he said, up to half of my kingdom. Okay? And Herodias' daughter looks at her mom's like, "He's in a good mood. What do you want?" And her mom says, "I want John the Baptist's head on a platter." Now, John the Baptist at the time was arrested. He was in prison. It says that when she asked for that, Herod went, so he regretted it right away, because he had respect for John the Baptist. Even though he didn't like him, he respected him, and he knew that John the Baptist was popular among the people, and to do this was bad. But he had said this in front of a bunch of people, and he didn't want to appear weak, so he carries it out. So they go cut John the Baptist's head off and bring his head on a platter into the party among a bunch of drunk people who celebrated even more so. Now, Jesus, this is his cousin. Don't deify him to the point you forget about his humanity. Jesus didn't even know this happened until John's disciples come deliver the news. It says in verse 12, John's disciples came for the body and buried it, and then they went and told Jesus what had happened. Verse 13 says, as soon as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat, look at this, to a remote area to be alone. Why? Because he was in pain. Here's what I'm going to tell you, and this is a bit of a caveat to where I'm eventually going to get, but it's worth being here today. What you do with your pain may be the most important factor to your quality of life moving forward. It's a big deal, what you do with your pain. And what we see of Jesus is Jesus immediately took his pain seriously and began to deal with it. When I say quality of life, I'm talking about both internal quality of life and external quality of life. Let's start internal. Here were the 3 things Jesus had to wrestle with. First of all, he had to wrestle with his sadness at the loss of his cousin. Okay, next birthday, he's not going to be there. And this can't be reversed. he had affection, and to understand that on this earth, there's a finality here. I'm not going to see him again here. And so just that sadness, he was gripped with it. For some reason, man, I've read this story so many times. For some reason, it just hit me different this time to think about the fact that every single one of us, whether you're online or here, if you've wrestled with that sort of like, they're gone here on earth. They're gone. Jesus wrestled with that. And he said, you know what, I'm going to wrestle with that on a boat in a remote place with me and my heavenly Father. But he had to deal with that pain, so the sadness of the loss. Number two, he had to deal with his anger toward the perpetrators. Okay? When he hears the news of not just that John is dead, it wasn't an accident, it was an intentional attack, and to hear the story that he was decapitated, head put on a platter, and brought into a party of drunk people who celebrated. I have a friend who a number of years ago, his mother was stabbed to death. And when it first happened, he called me and told me, and I was actually quite shocked at his composure. And at the time, I don't know if he was just in shock or it was in denial or whatever, but over the years of dealing with this, he knows, because of the autopsy report and everything, exactly how many times she was stabbed. He knows the location where she was stabbed. And he's told me before, he's like, I know my mom, she's a fighter. I guarantee you they had to stab her that many times to kill her because she's a fighter. Over 20 times. Over the years, because he knows what happened, he has imagined it. And it hits him in waves of anger. To picture it, I can't unsee that scene. And you have Jesus here who's dealing with the anger. This was senseless and now irreversible. And to imagine the face that he loved so much, the face of the greatest person that's ever lived, according to him, to be on the platter, to be celebrated, okay? He had to deal with that. The third thing he had to deal with is his feelings toward God. We tend to give Jesus sort of like to exclude this factor, but I don't know that we can. It says in Hebrews 11 that it says in Hebrews 4, it says that Jesus was tempted at all points as we are, yet without sin. He was tested in the same way. He dealt with a lot of the same feelings we did. Now, although Jesus' theology was probably better than ours, it doesn't mean that he wasn't in a place where he's with his Father going, really? Come on. John? And did it have to happen like that? Right? This is the same Jesus that right before he went to the cross was like, is there any way you can take this cup from me? Can we come up with a better plan? Is there something, like, not my will, but your will be done, I'm there, but could your will be something else? So more than likely, he's feeling the same thing in dealing with this internal. What I'm telling you is what you do, friend, with your pain might be the most important factor in your quality of life for you to ever come to peace. You never come to a good place, you never celebrate it, but you make peace with it. And if you don't make peace with it internally, it will haunt you. Often people, because they don't go inside enough to deal with the sadness and to deal with the anger and to deal with the confusion, the sadness overwhelms them, the anger overwhelms them, and their quality of life is so low, they spend their life looking for anesthesia. They spend their life looking for a numbing agent, something to dull this pain, something to make me forget about what happened, instead of going in and doing that work. And if you get to that place where you can make peace with all of it, now even your external quality of life is enhanced, because now you take things and now you can begin using them for other things. Now I can actually get back to work. Now I can actually be more effective. Now I can actually move ahead. And this is what we see even from Jesus. As he takes some time to step away, he had work left to do. And so the transition in the book of Matthew 14 goes from the beheading of John the Baptist, the grief of Jesus, into Jesus feeding the 5,000. The backdrop of Jesus feeding the 5,000 was it was right after he grieved the loss of his favorite cousin. So you know the story, 5 loaves, 2 fish, 5,000 hungry people. Jesus voila, boom, boom, 5,000 fish sandwiches. And then from there, they get in the boat to go across, and about 3 a.m, in the middle of the night, Jesus goes walking on water. The disciples think he's a ghost. Peter says, whoa, can I do this too? Jesus says, come on out. Peter gets out, and he begins to sink. And then Jesus asks the question, why do you have so little faith? And all us judgmental people go, yeah, Peter, why do you have such little faith? You little coward. Except I'm like, how would you not? How would you not? I'll tell you why Peter had little faith. Why Peter was a little confused, why Peter doubted, was because he's standing at the end of Matthew 14 doing the math and thinking back on the entire chapter and going, I'm going to try to reconcile this in real time, because that's a real wave, that's real wind, this is a deep place, it's very possible for me to drown right here and now, and God is potent, omnipotent enough to serve a huge banquet miraculously, but apparently he wasn't to save his favorite cousin from his head getting cut off. So I got to figure this out right here, right now, because my life is on the line. Which mood are you in, Jesus? Are you in the 5,000 mood? Or are you in the not show up for John mood? Oh, y'all don't want to talk to me today. You just want fairy tales and fantasies and superstitions, or do we want to have real theology? Because all throughout the Bible, this guarantee that because God's omniscient and omnipotent and he loves and we have an issue, and now that's a guaranteed solution, that is an improper expectation of what God is going to. But let me tell you, if you keep reading in the Gospels and go past it into the book of Acts, you'll see in chapter 7, a man full of faith dies a martyr's death. Stephen, first martyr, stoned to death. Well, why didn't that solution take place? So we all find ourselves in this position that Peter was in, going, what is a reasonable expectation? What can I expect from God? How do I resolve this? And the first answer is you need to walk into that tension and be honest. Be honest and ask that question instead of putting your fingers in your ears, closing your eyes, hoping for the best. So what do we do with this? I want to give you a few things that you can count on. I want to give you a few things that you can expect when you're walking through heart, soul, mind, strength, neighbor. The first is, I will say this, sometimes God does bring solutions. Sometimes God brings the very solution that you ask for. We see that throughout the Gospels, that Jesus healed people who couldn't walk, people who couldn't see. He would heal, and sometimes they would have a physical issue, and he would bring a physical healing. But like you saw 2 weeks ago in Pastor Eddie's message about the man who actually had a physical deal, before Jesus ever even did anything about the fact he couldn't walk, he gave him a spiritual solution and dealt with his sin and dealt with these other things, because he realized if the guy just walks out on 2 good feet, but he hasn't dealt with his sin and he's not dealt with his mind and he's not dealt with all the things that got him to where he was, all he would be a guy who's doomed but can also walk. He would just walk into trouble instead of being carried into it. So Jesus understands that there's more going on. Sometimes, like we see in Matthew 14, there was a hunger issue and God provided food. So sometimes there are those solutions, but other times God provides support. And the support comes sometimes through, I'm going through maybe something physical, and you may be in the place, let's say you're here and you're walking through cancer. Of course, the prayer is going to be a solutions prayer. Lord, would you dry this cancer up? God, would you get this cancer out of my body? I pray, Lord, that you would cause the report to come back miraculous and that there would be a solution. And yet sometimes it's okay to believe for that, but it's not a simple formula that if I just pray for it, that it's going to happen guaranteed every time. Sometimes God can do that, will do that, has done that, but also sometimes God will bring us support. You may be going through something in your body, and instead of that thing going away in your body, God may bring a person to support you in this journey. God may bring a thought. There have been things in my life I can testify to that have been going on physically, okay, in my family, or been going on physically with people I love, and I prayed for this, and yet it wasn't necessarily removed and there was a problem solved, but what happened is there was a new thought that came to my mind, or there was a new support. There was a peace that passes all understanding to guard my heart and mind as I walk through the thing. Go back to the story in Matthew 14. What you'll notice of Jesus is as Jesus is walking out on the water, what he says, the first thing that he goes at them with is their fear. Their fear. Of course, they think their biggest problem is the wind and the waves, and Jesus goes, don't be afraid. Now, to us as humans, when we hear fear not, the way that we think the fear would be eliminated or alleviated is by neutralizing the threat. Okay, for example, if you're in the middle of a lawsuit right now and you're hearing, from the Lord, fear not, you go, cool, I'll fear not when they drop the charges. Okay, if your business is in a place, in a precarious position, there's some kind of threat to your business, and you hear fear not, okay, yeah, fear not. You go, sure, I'll do that once the money comes in or once the threat is gone. But what you find is actually in Matthew 14, Jesus shows up, and when he says fear not, the storm is still raging. It's still raging. He didn't calm the wind and the waves and then go, don't be afraid. What he's introducing is a concept of the ability to have peace while the threat is there. We do have to, and I want to say this, and I always want you to leave happy and all this, but and I'm not trying to be morbid, but I think it's worth talking. Like, we do have to come to grips with the fact that we are mortal, and our bodies are going to go away. Our bodies are going to die. At some point, we will succumb to death. John the Baptist, it was a really horrible way that he died. But one of the interesting things is actually even in the book of Revelation, there's a famous verse where it talks about us overcoming, and it says they'll overcome by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. It's a very famous verse. It's often quoted in the book of Revelation. But what it says is, they came to a place where they did not love their lives so much that they feared death. Don't hear that wrong. Don't hear that as that they didn't love themselves or that they didn't value life. It's not that they had a death wish. It's that a work had been done so deep in their lives that they did not fear death. You see, oftentimes the pain that God wants to alleviate in your life is the pain associated with fear. He takes away your fear. What does this look like? I'll tell you what it looks like. What it looks like is what I've seen so many times. I've seen somebody who was in the middle of fighting cancer, who was going through chemo, who everybody in the room, everybody surrounding them was terrified. And the only person in the room who wasn't terrified was the person going through it. They had peace. How? How does that happen? How does that happen? It's a peace that passes all understanding to guard your heart and mind. It's in the middle of the thing. It's this. I can't promise you, Peter, as you stand on this water, I can't promise you that at some point you may not sink. Jesus was present and accounted for there and pulled him up and saved him in that moment. But Peter was confronted with the reality that John the Baptist had his head cut off. Well, what about poor John the Baptist? Why didn't God show up for him? How do you know God didn't show up for him? How do you know God, because he got his head cut off? How do you know God didn't show up for him? Go read Acts 7. Stephen the martyr, who I told you about. As Stephen the martyr was being stoned to death, which is one of the most horrific ways to die I can imagine. I mean, that's a pretty bad way to die. As he's being stoned to death, he is having visions of God's glory. And he's going, Lord, don't hold it against him. Take my spirit, Lord. And he's in a place where he is in communion and communication and has a peace that makes no logical sense. So just because John the Baptist died doesn't, how do you know that as he was crying out to God in that moment? Okay, now I'm sure that when they showed up, and he started to realize, I think these guys may want to cut my head off. I bet his prayer was probably a solution prayer. It was what mine would have been, Lord, why don't you do something real cool right now? But don't limit what you believe about the presence of God. When the presence of God shows up, when perfect love shows up, fear is cast out. Don't miss the miracle of the removal of fear, of fearlessness in the middle of the threat still looming.